It is. Good evening, everyone. We're about to get started, but I just wanted to give a quick announcement. My name's Jeremy Vaughn. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Programs and Director of Arts Advancement. That's a full breath at the university. Um, Mary Talks program is something we like to announce at the beginning of each program. There's a number of people joining us virtually tonight. We have over 100 people who will be viewing from California, Florida, Maine, Colorado. So this is a large outreach project for us to reach alumni who are not here in Fredericksburg. So just know that joining the 70 some of you here will be about 110 alumni and members of the public from elsewhere. So we're going to start in about 2 minutes. So just sit tight and thank you for being here. I'll let you know when it's time.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second Mary Talk of the season. My name is Karen Leno Januzzi, and I'm from the class of 71. I'm so pleased and honored to welcome you this evening to Mary Talk featuring Dr. Brooks Kuykendall as he presents Frank Sinatra and the development of the concept album. We're excited to welcome all participants of tonight's lecture, including those of you in the room with us, as well as a sizable virtual audience across the country and beyond. Like many of you, Frank was always singing in my home growing up, and seeing him in person was the thrill of a lifetime. So I know that this will be an enlightening presentation of the chairman of the board. There'll be time after the talk to ask questions, so keep that in mind as you listen to Dr. Kuykendall's presentation. Before we begin, a few words about Dr. Kuykendall. Brooks has served as a professor of music and the chair of the UMW Music Department since 2017. He earned his PhD in musicology from Cornell University and has published widely on British music of the 19th and 20th centuries, music by Sir Edward Elgar, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Benjamin Britten, Sir Thomas William Walton, and notably Gilbert and Sullivan. His blog, Settling Scores, has attracted the attention of both professionals and amateurs because of its focus on a topic that has otherwise been overlooked, the transmission of music through different notated sources. In the blog, he's covered topics from Gregorian chant to the soundtrack for Star Wars and plenty in between, but with a particular focus on the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. Tonight's topic takes him well out of his musicological comfort zone into a fascinating figure in American popular music, Frank Sinatra. It is now my honor to present Dr. Brooks Kuykendall and Frank Sinatra.
Thank you, Karen. You made it through musicological. Thank you for coming. Thank you also for the virtual audience joining us tonight. I think it's an interesting topic, and I hope you will find it so. I want to actually start, once I have my slides on the screen, I will start with an audio example. There we are. What an eerie effect. The high dissonant strings, the very low alto flute figure, the augmented second in the melody is reminiscent of the fate motive from Bizet's Carmen. That was pointed out to me by my 5-year-old son. And Carmen is and then, after that, of all things, a bass clarinet, a particularly sonorous and evocative instrument. Whatever else we might say about that music, I think we would be unlikely to guess that it was from an album of popular song recorded in 1958. A Hitchcock film score, perhaps, or maybe science fiction. No? And it would have been inconceivable a decade earlier to try to sell a popular song with an intro like that. What I'm considering tonight is the way in which a technological innovation opened up an artistic possibility, and the way in which one artist, together with lots of collaborators, explored that possibility. The innovation was the development of the long-playing record, the LP, and the artist was, of course, Frank Sinatra. Early disc recordings, and I mean from the earliest days in the 1890s into the 1930s and actually beyond, were manufactured on relatively thick shellac discs, designed for playback at a turntable speed of 78 RPM, or around that. The speed varied according to the manufacturer. The most common was a 10-inch disc, which would give something like 3.5 minutes of playtime, not much. 3 minutes could accommodate the vast majority of popular song, and so this format was perfect for that. But it didn't work as well for classical music. Longer pieces would either need to be abbreviated in various ways, or at least broken up so that they could fit into a series of different sides of the discs. Several discs, in other words, to hear the whole thing. The practical means of keeping these discs together, I don't need to hear that again, I'm sorry. The practical means of keeping these discs together was presenting them in hardbound volumes, like books. This is a 1927 issue from Columbia Records of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. It required 5 discs. That means 9 times that you're getting up to change the music to hear the whole piece. The presentation looked like hardbound family albums of the day. Here, in fact, is just such an album binding, not for photographs, but for records. But this was produced for holding individual discs that the consumer could include as they saw fit. This was not sold as an album. It was sold as a binding, and you supplied your own albums, and you could write your own index inside the front cover. This was a playlist in the 1920s. But this is why we use the word album for a new technology when multiple discs worth of material could fit on a single disc, an album all on one disc, 20 minutes on a side or 25. Soon after the 10-inch disc was expanded to be 12 inches, you could get 45, 50 minutes, close to an hour between the two sides of the disc. But all of that took time. Experiments with record companies from the 1930s, particularly Columbia Records, but also RCA, took quite a while to bear fruition in a version that would be commercially viable for the general public. One of the initial innovations had to be a different material than shellac. And various things were tried, lacquer and aluminum, but vinyl, of course, is what they settled on. And vinyl, the groove could be much smaller. You see earlier records that say micro groove. And also, it was sensitive enough, and for the same reason it was fragile, which is why you hear them scratch so much. It was sensitive enough that they could record enough information that the disc could move at a slower speed, which of course could expand the playing time. RCA went with 45, and Columbia went with 33 1/3, and 45 eventually became the default for singles, and even RCA had to go with Columbia's 33 1/3 RPM standard. Now, Sinatra's early career coincided with those technological developments, and at that time he was an exclusive Columbia artist. The first popular music LP issued by Columbia Records March 4th, 1946, was Sinatra. And they issued it in two formats because it took a while for people to adopt the new technology. And so on the left, you see the album released with 478 discs, and on the right, the single LP. The same content there. Of course, this is the way that companies have had to market things all the time. In the 1980s, LPs and audio cassettes and compact discs all shared the market with the same recordings available on all three, or VHS and Betamax video cassettes, if you can remember in the dark ages. But even into the 2000s, the Blu-ray and DVD, both competing for the market. Columbia kept doing these double issues up until 1950, but this was 1946. Now, a consequence of the new LP technology was that the listener has a less active involvement with the sequence of the music to be played. When the albums were released on 78s, and each side was a song, you could play them in whatever order you liked. You could repeat, you could skip without any trouble. On the LP, it became a little more complicated. You could hear all the sides on one side without any more effort. But if you wanted to select a track, you had to depend on the bands, as they were called, band 1, band 2, band 3, where the grooves were just spaced out a little more. When I was young, I used to think that was because there was no information, that it was silence on that. But it's really just the groove is spaced so that you could see where to put the needle. It takes effort and a steady hand, but you could choose the music you wanted to hear. By the time of the development of the vinyl LP, 12-inch LP, Sinatra's popularity was beginning to wane, and his relationship with Columbia was increasingly troubled. When he hit rock bottom in the early 1950s, and Columbia dumped him, the listening public was still gradually transitioning to the new technology, so that when he was signed on by Capitol Records in 1953, and from that point on, LPs had replaced singles as the default product. Yes, they were still issuing singles, but people had LP players, and that's what record companies concentrated on. Certainly the demographic of Sinatra's audience in the 1950s, not exactly youth culture anymore. Although Sinatra continued to have singles released throughout his career, their numbers decreased markedly in the 1960s, and by that point they tend to be extracts from albums rather than specially recorded numbers. At Capitol Records, Sinatra developed a strategy for his releases. The singles were almost all new songs, often songs written for him, sometimes written for a film in which he was starring, but in any case, songs in which there was an urgency for him to corner the market with his version. The albums, by contrast, were generally collections of older songs, sometimes decades old, but newly arranged and recorded. The albums became a means of manifesting an artistic vision. It was Sinatra before anyone else who recognized that the longer playing time of an LP, and more importantly, the comparative inconvenience to the listener of skipping a song, that all of that offered the scope for a more ambitious artistic statement from popular musicians. In concert, each song was necessarily isolated. You would sing a song, and then people would applaud, and you would sing another song, and people would applaud. But on an album where there was no applause, artists could control the environment in which the songs were presented, even if they couldn't control the environment in which the songs were played, the LP was played. Or could they? Because tonight I'm going to argue that Sinatra found a way to do just that. The term concept album is not monolithic. It can mean many different things. While my essential definition would be an album in which all of, maybe, the elements intentionally cohere to serve some larger artistic purpose, there are many different ways that can happen. Perhaps there's a narrative. Andrew Lloyd Webber's Evita, for example, was a narrative concept album, even though it says here an opera. It was an album before it was a stage show. The same is true of The Who's rock opera, Tommy. Perhaps the link, though, is not narrative. It's a more nebulous theme, like the psychedelic-inflected nostalgia of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I would say a musical style isn't enough to be the link. Artists often work in a fairly constrained musical style, Johnny Cash sounds like Johnny Cash in everything he recorded, although you can tell in a later album from an earlier one as his style gradually morphed and his voice gradually changed. His live album, At Folsom Prison, is not exactly a concept album. While many of the songs have a common theme of incarceration, they don't all. The album shows the care that Cash gave as he selected songs for his audience, but I don't think anything more than that. Effective as it is, I don't think he's trying to make a larger artistic statement with that album. Well, as the title of my talk tonight indicates, I think it is Frank Sinatra who should get the credit for recognizing and realizing the artistic potential of the LP record. The impetus for his approach, I believe, came from European classical music. Although Sinatra had no formal musical education, indeed he never really learned to read music, he was a devotee of classical music with a substantial record collection. He would use classical repertoire as a sort of shorthand to express to the arrangers he worked with what he wanted the music to sound like, particularly Nelson Riddle, who I'll talk about a good deal tonight. Riddle is quoted as saying that Sinatra said, "Make the eighth bar sound like Brahms," or "make like Puccini." Sinatra's favorite composer, at least in the 1950s and 60s, was Ralph Vaughan Williams. I didn't know that when I started working on Sinatra, but there at least my British music research interest and Sinatra managed to line up. A key factor that I think Sinatra picked up from classical music generally, and Ralph Vaughan Williams in particular, is the idea of a sound world unique to a particular work. You wouldn't confuse any of the movements of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that's this one, with any of the movements of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. The sixth is the Pastoral, even though Beethoven worked on those two symphonies simultaneously for about 4 years. They existed, if I can put it this way, in different domains of his creative imagination, and they have very different sounds. The same is true of the concept albums that Sinatra developed with Capitol Records in the 1950s. These albums each have their own mood, yes, but more than that, they each manifest a unique sound world. Take In the Wee Small Hours, the first of those in 1955. Now, any jazz band has a rhythm section. We usually think of it as being the piano, the guitar, the bass, and the drums. That's the rhythm section. And this uses the rhythm section, but it's augmented with a harp and a celesta. The celesta is the instrument that in the Nutcracker plays this. That's the celesta. There's the keyboard high-pitched bell sound. That sounds like, the piano, guitar, bass, drums, celesta, harp, and a large string section sounds like an instrumentation devised by Bela Bartok. But those are the hallmark sound of this album, In the Wee Small Hours. Sometimes that string section is even expendable with the rhythm section alone, the augmented rhythm section, sufficient to establish the aura of this album. I'm going to play the beginning of 4 different songs from this album, and I think you'll see that happening. Let's see if I can get this to play. The harp is pretty clear. The celesta is a little quieter. They're the lush string sounds.
In the wee small hour.
You can hear the celesta there. And there. With the piano.
Look at yourself if you had a cent.
There, the guitar is a little more prominent.
I took each word she said as gospel truth.
So here are the strings, but after the introduction, you'll hear the other instruments creep in. There's the harp.
What good is the
celesta.
scheming, the planning and dreaming that comes with each new love affair.
2 years later, on the other hand, is an album of chamber music. Look at the cover. The Hollywood String Quartet. Rather than the rich string textures of In the Wee Small Hours, the sound here is spare, intimate enough to fit in your living room. Close to you indeed. It's not just the string quartet. There are other solo guests in certain numbers, solo oboe, solo clarinet, solo horn, or an additional solo violin, as well as the rhythm section, piano, guitar, percussion, bass, and harp again. I'm not going to take any time today to play an example from this album, but I think you can see that a string quartet as the bedrock of a 1950s ballad album would be a distinct sound, easily recognized. By the way, the first violin and the cello are the parents of Leonard Slatkin, the conductor of the St. Louis Symphony, BBC Symphony. Leonard Slatkin grew up around Sinatra. The 1958 album, Frank Sinatra Sings for Only the Lonely, is a much grander project featuring a Beethovenian orchestra, full string section and pairs of woodwinds, flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, with a much smaller brass section. It was from this album that I took that clip with which I opened tonight's talk, and I'm going to come back to it in a little bit. Well, those are the ballad albums, or some of them. The up-tempo dance albums are much more similar to each other than these slower ballad albums, but even so, they have their own distinctive characteristics. While the constituents of a jazz orchestra are somewhat flexible, as a general rule, you would expect groups of saxophones, trumpets, and trombones, with a small string ensemble maybe, and the rhythm section. The saxophone players may double on clarinet or flute for special effect, and such a special effect is called for in this 1956 disc, Songs for Swingin Lovers. Compared to Sinatra's other up-tempo albums, I think it has a gentler sound. Note particularly Nelson Riddle's use of flutes as the highlight instruments, and also the use of the celesta, an instrument which made sense, I suppose, in The Wee Small Hours, but is a little unusual and a nice effect in a big band swinging album. Here are 3 quick examples.
I wanna go and bounce the moon just like a toy balloon.
Flutes.
You and I are just like a couple of tots running across a meadow,
Flutes.
picking up lots of forget-me-nots. You make me feel so young.
Flutes.
You make me feel there are songs to be sung, bells to be rung, and a wonderful fling to be flung. And even when I'm old and gray,
Flutes.
I'm gonna feel the way I do today, 'cause you make me feel so young.
That's, I think, a key part of this gentler big band sound on this album. Here's another clip.
You're getting to be a habit with me.
Celesta. Flutes again. That was a huge stretch of the album there, or the song, without Sinatra singing. That was, which is characteristic of these, well, in just about any singer doing this, that the band is going to have a time through the chorus. But it gives you a good opportunity to hear what that ensemble is behind him. And here's one more example from the same album. Flutes again. With the celesta punctuating things on top.
I took a trip on a train and I thought about you.
Flutes again.
I passed a shadowy lane and I thought about you. 2 or 3 cars parked under the stars.
An even more remarkable scoring, I think, is found in Sinatra's 1961 album, Come Swing With Me, which was a collaboration not with Nelson Riddle, but with arranger and bandleader Billy May. Here, the special effect, or should I say the gimmick, was a doubled brass section situated antiphonally in the studio, left and right, with Sinatra in the center. The effect is quite striking. The left channel is, in fact, all brass, 4 trumpets, 4 horns, 4 trombones, and tuba. And the right channel is a more conventional big band, minus the saxophones.
Give me 5 minutes more, only 5 minutes more. Let me stay in your arms. Here am I begging for.
That's an album that never would have happened without stereo. Stereo creeps in the late 1950s. This is 1961. And it's showing off the stereo effects. If you only had a mono system, you really wouldn't get this album. I mean, you wouldn't understand the album. Just as the exception proves the rule, I think it's the occasional failings that show the integrity of Sinatra's agenda in these albums. An interesting example is from the one I would regard as the first one, In the Wee Small Hours, originally released as a double LP on 2 10-inch discs, but it was later accommodated on just 1 12-inch disc. As I mentioned, Riddle's musical palette on this album is muted, a large string section and that augmented rhythm section, but restrained use of the woodwinds generally, and even more restrained use of the brass. I suspect that we can actually date Sinatra's initial idea for this album to sometime between March 1954 and February 1955. Because 15 of the 16 songs on the album were recorded in February and March 1955, but there is one outlier recorded 11 months earlier, March the 1st, 1954. And significantly, the song is for a larger, more conventional ensemble. It stands out for just that reason. It's a moment that disrupts the musical unity of the album, and I think it's a weakness. What you're going to hear is a crescendo that gets just too loud.
So now
I'll back off a little bit.
let's reminisce and recollect the sighs and the kisses, the arms that clung when we were young. Last
Now, the song definitely belongs on the album, but this arrangement doesn't quite. My suspicion is that the album was not even a glimmer in Sinatra's eye when this track was recorded in March 1954. And although it may have inspired the approach to the whole album, for all I know, the plan went off in a different direction and they didn't bother to rearrange and re-record the song. Still, I think it's a failing. As another example of a failure, which brings the rest of his accomplishments into sharp relief, the 1960 disc Nice and Easy was originally going to be called The Nearness of You, with that as a title track. Maybe that title was a little too close to Close to You, even if the two projects are very different musically. A month or so after the recording sessions for the album were completed, it was decided, by who I don't know, to replace the title track, a decision that resulted in a jarring disconnect. The new swinging lounge singer number, Nice and Easy, the title track, has nothing of the come hither lush string settings that characterize the rest of the album.
Don't you?
It's a nice song, maybe, but it doesn't fit. It stands out. It's a flaw in the finished product. So what Sinatra developed in his years at Capitol Records was a new artistic medium. The LP was not just a means of conveying a number of hit songs on one disc in one jacket. Sinatra recognized and realized the potential of the LP to convey a sustained musical experience. 40 or so, even 55 minutes in the case of one album, during which the artist could lead the listener into a mood, a narrative maybe, a whole new world. Doing this meant that every song didn't have to be a hit. The songs were chosen for what they contributed collectively, rather than how well they would stand on their own. So let's go back to where I started. The song is It's a Lonesome Old Town, and it was nearly 30 years old when Sinatra recorded it for Only the Lonely. Although it hadn't been forgotten in the intervening years, it wasn't exactly a hit in the late 1950s. Sinatra employs this song near the end of side A of the album, and the vacant eeriness of Nelson Riddle's setting seems to suggest staring into an abyss. As I said before, this wouldn't sell a hit song, or rather, it wouldn't sell a hit single by itself, but it is an incredibly effective moment within the context of the album, which I'm not giving you. Here's that intro again. The alto flutes coming in. And that bass clarinet. I love the bass clarinet. When the voice comes in, Sinatra seems on the brink of an existential crisis. The fate motive in the flutes punctuating his lines at first, but then the backup lines are transferred to the strings and eventually the French horn.
It's a lonesome
Here's the flute fate motive.
town when you're not around.
And again.
I'm lonely as I can be.
You're going to notice a low French horn creeping in here.
I never knew how much I missed you, but now I can plainly see.
It's creepy stuff. As he finishes the chorus, he overhears a bluesy clarinet, but it doesn't really join him. He's left alone, as the lyric suggests.
It's a lonesome old town when you're not around. How I wish you'd come back to me.
Now, usually at this point in a Sinatra song, he takes a break and the band plays some of the chorus. In this case, it's given to a solo trombone, and it seems at first in the wrong key. It's up a step. Notice the exaggeratedly wide vibrato of this trombone. This song first grabbed me this summer, and I was kind of excited about it, and I sent a link to Michael Morley, who's the office manager in music. We talk about music a lot in the music department. And it was summertime, nothing else was really going on. And he listened to it and emailed me back and said, sounds like a burlesque show there in the middle. And I puzzled over that at first because it hadn't sounded that way to me. But there is this unusually wide, vulgar, burlesque vibrato on the trombone. And it made me wonder, subsequently, if the cover image of The Crying Clown was already in Sinatra's mind before this arrangement happened? Did he instruct Riddle, make like a crying clown in this instrumental solo? But notice the Twilight Zone strings in the background. It would be Twilight Zone, but the drums and the bass keep chunking away. And then right at that moment, there's a transition back to our original key. That trombone solo was in the wrong key for some other reason, and we're wrenched back to the original key. The trombone continues on as a companion, but whatever it's doing, it seems to be mocking our loner protagonist.
I never knew how much I missed you.
Listen to the trombone right here.
But now I can plainly see it's a lonesome old town when you're not around. How I wish you'd come back to me.
And then for the coda, he's going to repeat that, how I wish you would come back to me. Listen to the sting on the word wish. It hurts. And the loner slinks off out of hearing.
How I wish you'd come back to me.
I think it's a devastating performance. I think it's an amazing song, but it works particularly in the context I'm not giving you, in that whole album, where it is this particular moment, I was going to say of relief, but it's of relief in the other sense. It's thrown into relief by the contrast of this very eerie, creepy song. The whole album is 55 minutes. I think it is Sinatra's effort at a song symphony, one indebted to Gershwin, perhaps in its jazz idiom, but no less indebted to Vaughan Williams, another poet of loneliness. Oh, sorry. The guy in the middle is Vaughan Williams. I've mentioned the size of the orchestra, but some of the textures Riddle derives from it suggest to me that Sinatra's request was make like Vaughan Williams. Here are a few moments from Vaughan Williams himself. This from the Symphonia Antarctica of 1952, a movement just called Landscape. It's pretty quiet. Very different and much earlier from Vaughan Williams' work is the beginning of the Norfolk Rhapsody, written in 1906. And this from a tone poem, also about 1906, in the Finn country. Now listen to Riddle's introduction to the song Goodbye on this album. Notice that harmony? In that last example, we hear not only the influence of Vaughan Williams, but of his own teacher, Maurice Ravel, as well as Claude Debussy. We are, after all, not that far removed from Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. I thought I was going to, yes, play it one more time. That half-diminished seventh chord, as we call it in music theory, resolving by common tone, was exactly the same we were in a different key, but exactly the same half-diminished seventh chord, resolving not to major, as Debussy did, but to minor. I don't think it works quite as well, but it's the same chord there. And then another example from Riddle, this is the intro to Gone with the Wind. I think I could put that example on for our music history class and trick them on a listening quiz into saying it's Debussy or Ravel. I won't do that. In the 1970s, when Sinatra was asked what was his favorite album of all that he had produced, he named this one.
Just like a leaf that has blown away, gone.
And I think his voice fits that. It fits that environment. It's not just the swinging ballad albums. I think the reason that Riddle's collaborations with Sinatra were so successful is that he did not really have much of a style of his own. Riddle. I might here make a distinction between Sinatra, the artist, that is, who had the vision for what he wanted to achieve, and Riddle as a craftsman who made it happen. One might think of the difference between the architect and the builder, but the parallel is not exact. Rather, it's the master architect and the firm charged with fleshing out the details. If Riddle was something of a stylistic chameleon, though, as a craftsman, he brought a consistent approach to his work, a determination to use the best ingredients available a way of laying out a texture around the singer, those are recognizable riddle elements. But it is significant that when Sinatra first signed at Capitol Records, he wanted to work with Billy May. He had not ever heard of Nelson Riddle. And he only worked with Nelson Riddle because Billy May wasn't available. Riddle's task for the first session was to write arrangements that sounded like Billy May. They even told Sinatra they were by Billy May. With May, Sinatra knew what he'd get and probably didn't need to give further instructions. As good as the Billy May albums are, I don't think they compete artistically with what Sinatra achieved with Riddle. Come Fly With Me, a Billy May collaboration, is a collection of great performances, of great arrangements, of great songs. But the common theme of travel is not enough to unify the whole into a concept album of the type I'm talking about this evening. The songs sound too different from each other. They exist as discrete numbers that happen to be on the same disc and happen to be about different places in the globe. Even the antiphonal brass sections that distinguish Come Swing With Me, we heard that earlier, show Sinatra going to May for a sound that May had already established. Come Swing With Me is patterned after Billy May's Big Fat Brass, a 1958 disc, which has a nearly identical scoring for two brass ensembles. Sinatra wanted in on that. And he was asking May to do something that he had already done in the past. Do it again. With Riddle, by contrast, Sinatra created a series of new sound worlds, each unique for a disc-length project. Even though this has not been the default for those who have followed Sinatra, I think that this was his most important contribution to the development of the concept album. He demonstrated the artistic potential of the LP, even in a popular idiom. Now, in the digital era, we're moving back into an atomized environment like those 78s. With CDs, it was easy enough to skip or repeat tracks. With MP3s and other streaming files, you don't even have to buy the whole album. Sinatra would have been furious. I want to close tonight, though, by just saying a few words about teaching Sinatra here at the University of Mary Washington as a topic. This is just my third year, as Karen said, and as she also said, this isn't the area I work on. I work on Gilbert and Sullivan. I work on Bach. But I started working on Sinatra. I knew some of the albums, and I liked them, but I thought it might be a good topic for an FSIM. The FSIM is the first-year seminar, and I thought maybe the students would be interested in Sinatra, not necessarily for the music, although I do have some musicians in that class, and this is my second time teaching it. I had some last time as well. But Sinatra was connected with everybody, and he had such a long career. He was born in 1915. He died in 1998. He was already a professional in the mid-1930s, early 1930s even, first as a singer and as a teen celebrity, and then in film, and film over a fairly wide, both a wide career in terms of years and a wide career in terms of the sorts of roles that he played. He was the bad boy sometimes, he was the Catholic priest sometimes. Sometimes it's a wide variety of roles there, and he did get an Oscar for his performance in From Here to Eternity. But he was also tied up in politics. He was a Roosevelt supporter and a Kennedy supporter and a Adlai Stevenson supporter and a Ronald Reagan supporter. He was, of course, active in the Civil Rights Movement and had advocated for particularly Sammy Davis Jr. in his career. So that my students, no matter what their interests are, there's something about Sinatra that would interest you. And so that has been fun, but it was an entirely new topic for me. But as I was working on that, reading up on Sinatra, listening to a lot of Sinatra, my kids have been deluged with Sinatra for 3 years now, and they now have opinions and have requests anytime we're in the car. But I realized, well, Sinatra is just as relevant in the other classes that I'm teaching for music majors, music history. So just today, as it happens, we were talking about concept albums in a course that is a survey of music history, but it's a survey that focuses just on two genres, concertos, featuring a single instrument usually, and the song cycle. And so the argument I was making, and I'm not the first to make it, is the concept album is the natural outgrowth of the classical genre of the song cycle. And so we were looking at Sinatra as the pioneer there. But even in the music history class that I teach those same majors next semester, one of the questions that we look into is how does the technology in hand affect the art that the artist is producing? And there, the example that I'm interested with Sinatra is not the concept album, it's the microphone. Because Sinatra was the first to recognize the microphone was not just a necessary evil in making a recording. It is a musical instrument of its own right, and he knew how to use it. The way, when he has the microphone close, when he has it farther away, the sounds he produces, that's part of the Sinatra style that so many people have tried to imitate. Now, putting Sinatra into the canon of what I teach music majors is just adding one more dead white male. It's a very different dead white male than so many other ones that I'm usually talking about. So I think it's an interesting topic. I'm delighted to have had you here tonight. I'll take some questions, but that's what I have. Yes.
What proportion?
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. For the people online, can we use the mic?
I can repeat the question too if I need to.
Let me know about my microphone use. What proportion of his success as a singer do you think depended on the great arrangers that he had?
I think in the 1940s, probably very little at all. He did work with Harry James, he worked with Tommy Dorsey, and so their arrangers were doing charts that featured him as the soloist in the ensemble, but basically his fame in the 1940s was a sex symbol. I think in the 1950s, it's absolutely that. It is that Nelson Riddle reinvented Sinatra so that it was no longer the teen celebrity. It was the sadder but wiser. You know, he's been through one divorce. He was on the rocks with Ava Gardner, and he was crying into the microphone, and Riddle made it into a musical environment where that made sense. Sinatra knew what he wanted, and Riddle made it happen. So I'd say by the time we get to the 50s, it is absolutely what the arrangers are doing. They were working with a fine instrument. Sinatra had an incredible musical sensibility, and he had the instrument to go with it. But I think without those arrangers who were putting him in the jewel in the right setting, basically, I don't think it would have been the phenomenon. He would not have been able to make the comeback that he did.
Good evening.
Good evening. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question to you is, could you comment on his work with Gordon Jenkins?
I did not mention Gordon Jenkins, and that really is well, you have to cut something. Jenkins, Billy May, and Nelson Riddle are the three main arrangers he's working with in the 1950s, and he does a number of these other albums with Jenkins. He goes to Jenkins rather like he goes to May for these up-tempo, very, very brassy numbers. He goes to Jenkins consistently for slower ballad albums with lots of strings. Jenkins really knew how to write for strings. And Jenkins does a good job of setting Sinatra's voice. And he sticks with Jenkins longer than anybody else. He's the longest collaboration he has because he works with him a little bit before he even gets to Capitol. And in Trilogy, which is a 1979 album, triple album, the past, the present, and the future, Jenkins had the daunting, impossible assignment of the future. That triple album is sometimes described as two LPs and a Frisbee, because the last album, the future, entirely new compositions. None of them are old songs. Jenkins has to write basically a cantata with voices, and there's What Time Does the Next Miracle Leave? This sort of science fiction, space age Sinatra album. I think it's hard to look past that particular album to really assess Jenkins' positive contributions, but I would put him in line with Riddle and May for, to go back to that first question, enabling Sinatra's comeback at all. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it because I should have. I'm a little intimidated because Paul Rollins up here actually played with Sinatra, so I don't know what he's going to ask me.
I'm on. How do you like that? All right. Matter of fact, that was not why I was going to ask this question, but you and I have talked about this, and I was always curious as to, because both Billy May and Nelson Riddle were trombonists, which, by the way, I am too, but we won't go there. But I'm just trying to figure out what it was about their background that got them hooked together, because I never researched that. You know, I just know that Sinatra himself, he knew the charts that we played behind him.
Yep.
backwards and forwards and upside down and turned a phrase better than anybody I've ever worked with, and the vocal end of it ever. Yeah, you got a thought on that?
Well, I have thoughts. I think your thoughts are probably more valid than mine. For someone who could not read music, although you see him using, a vocal sheet to get through an arrangement, he could see what the contours were, but he would be able to say, bar 38, I think there was something wrong in the trombone. Maybe he was talking about you then. This sense of, we need to do that take again because something happened right there. So he knew, as you say, he knew that music very, very well. And at that point, why bother to read music? I mean, don't learn it if you don't need it. But why Riddle? I thought Billy May was a trumpet player. Maybe he was trombone. Okay. Why trombone players have that gift or have tended in those examples to become those arrangers, I don't know. I wonder if part of it is just your position in the band where you hear so much. A trumpet player can't hear as much of what's going on because they're making so much of the noise. This is me speaking without much experience here, where the trombone player is in the midst of it, in the way that Mozart, when he played string quartets, preferred to play the viola, because he was in the middle of the texture and could control more of it. So I don't know. Certainly the dynamic range of the trombone beats anybody else, and so you have more control with that. I would be curious to know your thoughts, but we can.
Well, I don't have an answer for it. I met Nelson way back. It was like I was still in the '60s, but we didn't talk about that. It was just I was a kid and freaked out that I was sitting there with Nelson. So
Yeah.
But anyhow, I'm just curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Ask me about Gilbert and Sullivan. I don't know.
Please.
Hi, I'm sorry I've already graduated because I would have loved to take your class as a historian. But I've heard it said that as talented as he was, Frank Sinatra was also very, very humble, and that he actually kind of disliked being around arrogant people. Is that something that you've read about, heard?
I don't know that I know enough to answer that question with any sort of authority. He seems to have been somewhat of an introvert. And although he could be very aggressive and very hard to work with in some respects, and he certainly demanded the best. He was giving his best, so everybody there had to be giving their best, and he'd get rid of players, if they weren't doing what he wanted them to do. But many people have written about him. I keep running across this. Oh, he was a fabulous host. He made sure your glass was full. If you wanted something, he'd give it to you, but he would be drinking a Coke and eating a hamburger, while everybody's serving caviar. And certainly you see a lot, he valued his time alone. As much as he is on the stage with other people, like with the Rat Pack and the interchange with other people, and that when he recorded all of these albums, very unusually for our standards today, he recorded them with an audience. It was a studio recording with 20 or 30 or 50 people there being as quiet as they could on folding metal chairs. So he needed that to perform. He didn't do that in a sound booth. He didn't do tracks added later. He did them as live performances in the studio. So it's this, it's a complicated man. He needed that, and he needed away from it. I don't know. I think it's fascinating.
Probably have time for one more. John, you want?
Do you know if the stimulus for any of his concept albums was perhaps a single song that got him excited and then he built the theme around it?
You would think that if that was ever true, it would be in the Wee Small Hours. But that album was mainly done before that song was handed to him. It was a brand new song, not written for the album. But some of the other albums have songs that were written particularly for it, like "Come Fly with Me." I just don't know enough. I don't know of a case where one song was enough to say this was going to be it. I suspect in the Wee Small Hours it was Last Night When We Were Young, and that they think, we could make an album with this. But I don't know, and I haven't seen a smoking gun on that. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
At this time, and thank you all very much for being here, but at this time, the Alumni Association has a small gift they'd like to present to Dr. Kuykendall. And we can give him another hand. Thank you again for joining us, both in person and digitally, for tonight's presentation. And we hope that you'll mark your calendars for our next Mary Talk, which will be on Wednesday, February 12th. College of Business professor and alumnus Dan Wolf will be our next presenter. And for now, we invite you to stay, enjoy some refreshments before departing in the cold weather. Thank you and good night.